Cool. Let me get started then. Yeah, let me start with this. All right, so this is the last day of the Kucheza masterclass, and I just want to talk about a few more practical game design advice. So first of all, I really recommend this YouTube channel. He does some like very interesting, just general, insightful like analysis of several different games. And he also gives a lot of very good advice in like practically becoming a game designer. Can I open this video? Yeah, let me just open it up. Seems to be having network issues. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, he just gives some practical advice on actually getting into the industry. So I'll just play that now.
Asked more than anything, it's this. How do I become a game designer? I get emails from kids and teenagers and people bored of their jobs who would love to turn their passion for games into a career, who actually design the mechanics, systems, and levels that I talk about on this show. Unfortunately, I'm not really equipped.
Oh, good morning, Vincent.
Good morning. Yeah, good morning. Yep.
Yeah, so we're just playing a video about practical advice into the industry. So I'll just replay that then.
If there's one question I get asked more than anything else, it's this. How do I become a game designer? I get emails from kids and teenagers and people bored of their jobs who would love to turn their passion for games into a career and be the ones who actually design the mechanics, systems, and levels that I talk about on this show. Unfortunately, I'm not really equipped to answer this question. However, I do have some contacts who can help. So, over the last month, I've been talking to an enormous number of game designers, level designers, employers, recruiters, educators, and students, all in the hope of answering the most fundamental questions about getting into the biz as a designer. Starting with the most important question of all, what does a game designer actually do? The answer to this question is going to depend entirely on the size of the studio, the type of games they make, and the structure of their teams. Because depending on where you work, the design role might be a very general position or an extremely specialized one. On a very small mobile game, for example, the game designer might be responsible for every aspect of design. But on a larger title, the role is likely to be split between game design and level design. Go even bigger, and those roles might be split up even further. There are gameplay designers who focus on second-to-second interactions, and systems designers who look after overarching concepts like progression. Level designers might be split into quest designers and open-world designers. You might have narrative, UX, economy, and technical designers who are a bridge between design and code. There's no saying how specific these roles can be. On Red Dead Redemption 2, there were people who focused exclusively on designing systems for the horse. But okay, what do these people actually do? Well, if we look at game designers, their job is to come up with ideas for mechanics and systems. If those are approved by the creative leads, the designers will create detailed design docs and asset lists to help programmers and artists turn those ideas into reality. Once those features exist, designers will be given tools to manipulate the mechanic further, perhaps a simple scripting language to plan out interactions or a spreadsheet of stats to change. Level designers, on the other hand, are going to be creating the environments for the player to explore and traverse, using the toys provided by game designers. On most big games, levels are made in greybox, simple, untextured geometry that will be dressed up by artists. Level designers may also do scripting for specific encounters or to tie missions together in an open world. Both roles are highly collaborative because designers will be working closely with artists, animators, programmers, writers, and others to turn their ideas into something pretty and playable. And highly iterative, as ideas will be endlessly tweaked and changed in response to playtesting. Okay, if that sounds interesting to you, let's ask the next question. How do you become a designer? It's the million-dollar question, and from speaking with my industry experts, I reckon you really need 4 things to get a job as a designer. You need to be able to think in terms of design. You need soft or interpersonal skills like communication. You'll need a strong portfolio to show what you can do, and for a lot of roles, you'll need some level of experience in the games industry. I'll come back to the first 2 when I'm talking about interviews. But for now, let's chat about portfolios and experience. If there's one piece of advice I got from pretty much everyone I talk to, it's this: make stuff. Show people that you have the ability to design a game or level and then put that together in a portfolio. For example, this is Persis, a super short game with fully destructible environments which helped Zachary Priest land a job on Watch Dogs Legion. So, if you want to be a game designer, your portfolio should include small projects like this that show your ability to come up with an interesting mechanic or system. These days, it's entirely possible to actually make these games using tools like Unreal Engine and Unity. But if you really don't want to learn how to code, you could use the PlayStation 4 game Dreams, or use Tabletop Simulator to make board and card games. These don't need to be full games, they can be vertical slices, game jam projects, and prototypes. You can also work with others to make a game, but when it comes to your portfolio, you need to clearly explain which bits you personally came up with. Whatever the case, you've got to show you're working. Make sure you have clear documentation for how you dreamt up, designed, implemented, and refined your ideas, so you can show potential employers proof of your design thinking skills. For level designers, it's all about making an actual level. Again, you can use something like Unreal or Unity, but it's perfectly acceptable to use modding tools and level editors for existing games. And if you can make a level that's relevant to the company you're going for, even better. I spoke to one designer who got the job because they'd made a level for the firm's previous game. Whatever's on your portfolio, make sure your stuff is finished, even if it's incredibly short. Try to focus on your best work and always pick quality over quantity. And while downloads and documentations are great, employers can't play and read everything, so pack your portfolio with videos and screenshots. Now, let's talk about experience. While some studios will absolutely have entry-level positions for design, they're uncommon and highly sought after, so you can boost your chances of getting hired by getting experience in the industry. One way to get this is through placements like internships, trainee positions, and work experience posts, which can absolutely turn into full-time roles at the company if you do well. Another common approach is to start in quality assurance, or QA, or game testing. This gives you experience in the biz and a first-hand look at how studios operate. Again, it's not uncommon for QA testers, especially those embedded in the development team, to impress their bosses and get moved into design roles at the same company. But remember that QA is a vitally important role in of itself and shouldn't be seen as just a stepping stone to design. Perhaps the best advice is to remember that your first job probably won't be designing games at Blizzard or Bungie. You can't be picky at this stage, so get experience at places making mobile games, or kids games, or even gambling games, before making the leap to the studios making your favourite blockbusters. Now there's one pretty stellar way to get both a portfolio and experience, and that's university or college. In 2021, there's a huge number of courses for game design all around the world, like DigiPen in Washington, Teesside University in the UK, Breda University in the Netherlands, and RMIT in Australia. If you take these courses, you'll be taught game design theory and enough programming to get you started by people with industry experience. You'll make a strong portfolio of work using your end-of-year projects. Persis from earlier was actually Zach's project at Staffordshire University in the UK. You'll also get to meet friends to build games with, and you'll make connections in the industry, and you'll often get access to work experience posts and graduate positions. This is a strong and increasingly popular route into the industry, but almost everyone I spoke to, including the lecturers themselves, warned that the college diploma itself isn't the important bit. Instead, it's about making the most of the opportunities and connections you're provided, and it's about having the time to really focus on building out your portfolio. So ultimately, a game design degree is not a guarantee of a good job in the industry. And it's also definitely not a requirement for many positions, which is good because depending on where you live, university can be an expensive proposition. If you do decide to study game design, make sure you research the school carefully. Look at who is teaching and their credentials and experience. Look at which studios the university has good connections with and where graduates have ended up. And definitely look out for predatory, for-profit colleges in the US. Always do your research before you enroll. It's worth mentioning that other skills and educational backgrounds can help you stand out as a candidate. For example, while coding is rarely needed as a designer, some ability to program will help you communicate better with engineers and help you understand the scripting tools you'll be using. Same goes for understanding other roles and pipelines like art and audio. Also, knowledge of relevant disciplines such as economics, architecture, art, and psychology could make you a better candidate when going toe-to-toe with those who have exclusively studied game design. And finally, we can't discount the social side of things. The classic, it's not what you know, it's who you know. Making strong connections in the industry through networking events and social media can open up doors that others can't even see. But okay, you've got your CV, your portfolio, perhaps some experience under your belt, perhaps you've even got a degree in game design. You've applied for a job, and you've got an interview. Congratulations! And so, how do you ace a design interview? When you're interviewing for a design position, employers are really looking for those two skills I mentioned earlier, design thinking and interpersonal skills. For the latter, you'll get questions that are all about judging your personality to see if you have the right attitude and will fit the studio's existing culture. So the interviewer wants to know if you are a team player who can resolve conflict and adapt to someone else's vision. Do you have good communication skills, including confidence in pitching your ideas? And are you resilient to feedback on your work? Don't be surprised if the employer dismantles your portfolio pieces to see how you'll react to criticism of your ideas. For design thinking, the employer really wants to know if you can think about games on a deeper level than a typical fan or consumer. Do you get how games work? Do you understand how changes can impact on other aspects of a game? I've heard more than one studio ask candidates what would happen if you remove one of the options in rock, paper, scissors to see how they'd work through the problem and show that they understand game balance. It's very common to be asked about the games you've been playing lately. This isn't small talk. It's a chance for you to show some analysis, criticism, and understanding of design. You can practice this by analyzing, reviewing, and breaking down the games you play, like some kind of knockoff GMTK. If you nail the interview, you may be given a design test. This is where you're asked to prove your design skills, usually on paper, but perhaps in a scripting tool or level design tool. For a game design position, you may be asked to take an existing game and add a new mechanic, or show how you would change some aspect of the game. For a level design test, you may be asked to plot out a map for a short level that includes a new mechanic or an enemy encounter. This will usually involve the studio's existing games, so be familiar with their back catalogue. These can be pretty stressful, especially if you're asked to do it on-site at the studio and if it's under a time constraint. So I've included a link to a great GDC talk about what to expect from design tests to help you prepare. Now, if you don't get the job, that sucks. Make sure you get some feedback so you can improve in the future. But if you do get the job, hooray, you're in the industry. And so the question to ask is game design a dream job?
So I'll probably stop it from there because it gets a bit too deep. But the main things that you need to focus on if you want to view this as a career is just again, design thinking, communication skills, and making that portfolio. So a lot of people, when they hear they need to make a portfolio, it sounds very daunting. But it can be as simple as just showing, things that you worked on. It does not need to be anything fancy, but showing that you have the ability to make something finished is a very valuable skill. If you're looking for a website to host your portfolio on, I very highly recommend using GitHub Pages. It's where I host mine, for example. So let me just bring it up. So GitHub Pages is essentially a free hosting service provided by GitHub, essentially. So when you make a GitHub account, you're able to host one free site. So for example, if I use mine, I've just created a site where I just show some of my projects I've worked on, like games I've made, some other programming projects that I've done, as well as my contact details. So something as simple as this can be a good way of showing a portfolio. I will link this in chat just to have it saved. Yeah, that's some like pretty practical game design advice for if you want to pursue it as a career as well, just quickly. But anyway, I'm gonna move on to the review section of this. So the first thing we covered in the first day was mechanics. So just to recap, game mechanic is just a rule that governs how like the world or the player will interacts with the world, really. And I try to stress that mechanics are one in the physical world, as well as in the video games that you play like every day. And it can be a bit weird to hear that they have similarities, but if you break it down to like the steps, they are very, very similar. And if you add or remove different mechanics, you can end up with some really interesting concepts. So, for example, with football, or one of the examples we brought up was football, right? And if we change things like you have to use a car and the ball explodes when it hits a goal, you suddenly turn football into something like Rocket League with just a few simple changes. On day 2, we talked about making a prototype and how to do that practically in Unity. So I showed you a bit about the layouts and discussed how you can turn these mechanics we talked about into practical scripts. I also talked about minimal viable product, which is essentially just the simplest core mechanics of your game, essentially what makes it fun. And I try to explain how to identify that. So mainly mechanics that like your game can't function without. So no like extra features that like make it like, fancy or nice to play, just like the core gameplay loop, essentially. But going on to the programming section, we covered quite a lot. It was quite a long session on Wednesday. But just to recap relatively quickly, we talked about different variable types. Actually, to mention a few. So we talked about 2 different types of representing numbers: integers and floating points. There is actually another one called doubles, but I won't get into that. It's just imagine it like a floating point number with more decimal places. We also had Booleans. If I can just add that here. Yeah, we also had Booleans as well as I think we also mentioned the lists as well. We also talked about if and switch case statements. The latter being more used for when you have one variable and you want to switch between them very quickly. Let me just bring that up again just to show. Just one moment. But if statement is just essentially being if anything within the condition, it runs a certain section of code, whereas a switch case will only take one condition in order to run those bits of code. All right, let me swap windows quickly. All right, you should be able to see my screen now. Choose. All right. So this loads up. All right, cool. So yeah, with if statements, I think I forgot to mention actually. Yeah, so with if statements, you can everything within these parentheses. If that's true, then it moves on to this block of code. But you can actually have multiple conditions. So if you do double and, let's say like if 1 equals 1, that's always going to be true. But you can also do cases where it can be either. So let's say if 2 equals 3. So obviously this is wrong, but this will still run because it's if either of these cases are true. So that's just one thing I wanted to mention quickly about if statements. But again, switch cases takes one condition and then just runs different cases and has a default case. You don't have to include the default, but it's an option. So let me just go back. So on the 4th day, we had the opportunity to interview Osaze, who is the concept artist of Wild Kingdoms. Let me just bring up his Instagram page again, because his stuff is honestly very inspirational. One thing I didn't get the opportunity to talk about that day, though, was just some practical tools you can use. So like the first being Photoshop, obviously. That was like the main tool that most creatives use, and it's also what Osaze, that's his main workspace. It can be a bit expensive, or it's notorious for being expensive rather. So I wanted to discuss a few other options as well. Mainly being Sprites. So Sprites is, sorry, I don't know why my system is being so slow today. Yeah, Sprite is essentially a pixel art program. So I use it a lot for some of my projects, and it's very easy to use. It has a very simple animation workflow, very similar tools to Photoshop in terms of layers and like color palettes and stuff like that. And it's just very easy to just like export that into Unity. I didn't get to go into detail about how animation works in Unity, but I will reference some resources later. In terms of the sound design aspect, something I use as well is a program called BFXR. It lets you make very quick and easy 8-bit sound effects. So if you imagine any of those like old Atari games or just any of those old games from like the 90s and 2000s, you can make very similar sound effects to that essentially. So I just wanted to quickly play the trailer for Sprite just to like give you a look of what it's like. Is the audio playing? Oh, hold on. Man, I'm having a lot of issues. It's playing. Okay. All right. Let me try and play from here.
Yes.
But yeah, that's a Sprite. It's got a lot of power to it, even though it's a very simple program, really. It is paid, but there is a free trial and a few other free options that they offer. For Photoshop, it's a bit more complicated. You may need to get some sort of teacher or student deal, because I know they do various different options. So the last one I want to talk about was Bosca Coil. It's essentially very similar to BFXR, where you make like 8-bit music, basically. It's pretty simple to use. It's very similar to what's it called? The Apple, the iMusic software, where you just have you have the different notes and you can kind of just edit it note by note, adding different instruments. Yeah, it's very useful if you're looking for that sort of 8-bit style of game. But if you're going for actual music, something like FL Studio is probably your next best option. If you're a musician, you probably know some better tools, but those are the ones I know by experience. Yeah, those are the tools I've wanted to recommend. But I also want to talk about an interesting concept by Game Maker's Toolkit brought up again, which is essentially designing your visuals around the gameplay, which is something Nintendo does a lot. So just give a quick overview. It's essentially designing your visuals around how something's meant to play, which I'll just get into now. Tell me if there's any audio issues, by the way.
So let's say you want to make a video game. Where do you even begin? Some developers start with a story they want to tell, or a premise they want to explore. Others start with some emotion they want the player to feel, like terror or accomplishment. Others still start by using the technology to simulate something like a planet or a universe. And of course, plenty of developers start by taking a game that already exists and adding in a few extra features. But Nintendo is predictably quite different. Whether it's making a brand new game or the latest entry in the long-running Super Mario series, Nintendo always starts with the same goal: coming up with a new way to play. So what you do in the game and how you do it is used as the catalyst to drive everything else. From the design of the main character, to the way you deal with enemies, to the genre of music on the soundtrack. That's how we make games at Nintendo, says Shigeru Miyamoto, creator of Mario, Zelda, Pikmin and more. We get the fundamentals solid first, then do as much with that core concept as our time and ambition will allow. And so, in this episode of Game Maker's Toolkit, we're going to look at how one of the world's greatest game developers finds success by prioritizing play. In many of its games, Nintendo starts by coming up with some interesting new action for the main character to perform. The late Gunpei Yokoi said, "I first take the character which you're going to control and replace them with a dot as a placeholder. Then I think about what kind of movement would be fun." The most famous outcome of this way of thinking is this guy. Yahoo! You might know him as Mario, but when he arrived on the scene he was simply known as Jumpman, because this portly Italian plumber is defined by his leap. Not only does he have the most dynamic and expressive jump in all of gaming, 2D or 3D, but his breakout game, Super Mario Bros., is all about the jump. Mario leaps onto platforms and over pipes. He jumps into bricks to break them and blocks to unleash power-ups. And that includes the Fire Flower, which shoots at an annoying 45-degree angle, meaning you have to jump to get a good shot. And the flagpole is always one brick off the ground, so you have to jump to finish the level. Miyamoto toyed with other ideas, including a shoot 'em up stage, but dropped them because we wanted to focus on jumping action. Oh, and don't forget about jumping on enemies to kill them. That might seem like an obvious way to dispatch foes, as that's how Sonic, Aladdin, and scores of other platformer heroes do it, but get this, no one did it before Mario. Miyamoto came up with that by asking what is the logical way to defeat an enemy in a game about jumping. There's a real advantage to forging a game around a strong main mechanic. When you can interact with almost everything in the game by using this mechanic, Nintendo can make a game where the player's range of actions is very small and easy to learn, but the number of things they can interact with is huge. When talking about Pikmin, Miyamoto said the basic action that you conduct is very simple. It's a matter of simply throwing the Pikmin at tasks and calling them back. And yet, with the Pikmin's abilities and the breadth of strategies available, it opens up broad possibilities of how you can approach the gameplay. Other examples of unique actions include shooting a water gun, firing ink, turning into a painting, plucking things out of the ground, and using a vacuum cleaner. In Luigi's Mansion for GameCube, Luigi interacts with the world almost exclusively through his vacuum cleaner. He can't even jump, but where his brother overcomes every challenge with a big springy leap, Luigi uses his Hoover to solve puzzles, suck up ghosts, collect loot, check for booby-trapped doors, and more. So while some developers might say their game is about prejudice or ideology or the decline of the American frontier, how many games are literally about using a vacuum cleaner? And when Nintendo needs to add in extra mechanics, it can attach them to those main actions. For example, Splatoon is primarily about shooting ink and swimming in ink, and so you can reload your gun or climb up a high wall by shooting ink on the floor and then swimming in it. No extra buttons required. God, that's good. Of course, not every game is built around some brand new mechanic. Nintendo is, after all, not exactly known for making entirely new games and characters, or new IPs as the industry calls them. And there are only so many things you can strap to the back of a Mario brother. But Nintendo games are still driven by new ways to play, and so sometimes it's about putting a new twist on an already established mechanic. That might involve reinventing 2D gameplay in a 3D world, as we saw in Mario 64 and Zelda Ocarina of Time. It might be about putting those old mechanics in an interesting new context, like Super Mario Galaxy, which is still fundamentally about jumping, but now in microgravity, or how Pikmin 3 is still about commanding Pikmin, but now with the added stress of juggling 3 heroes. And sometimes Nintendo looks to come up with an interesting new system that governs how you play, like the 3-day timer in Majora's Mask, or the interconnected map of Metroid. Whatever the case, there's got to be some new gameplay that can drive things, or Nintendo says there's no point making the game. When Miyamoto was told that fans wanted to see a new F-Zero game, he said, "I'd like to ask those people, why F-Zero? What do you want that we haven't done before?" To Miyamoto, the thought of just making another racing game with more attractive graphics is unfathomable. Nintendo designers are big fans of the design principle, form follows function, which basically means that how something looks is determined by how that thing works. It's something that Miyamoto likely picked up when studying industrial design at college. And it's why boos blush when you look at them, and why enemies that charge at you in Super Mario World look like quarterbacks, and it's why whenever Nintendo re-releases the original Mario Brothers, it swaps turtles for spinies because everyone keeps trying to jump on the damn turtles. But Nintendo goes further than that, and uses the new gameplay at the heart of a game to determine almost every aspect of the presentation. Once Splatoon's mechanics had been developed, producer Hisashi Nogami says we then conceived the characters and the world vision to match perfectly with the gameplay. So if you ever got to play Splatoon during the prototyping phases, you would have controlled a big white block. The designers came up with the Squid Kids afterwards when they needed to find a character that could swim in ink and would clearly separate the inking and swimming mechanics. And entire characters can come about as extensions of the mechanics themselves, like Navi, who is a personification of the Z targeting system in Ocarina of Time, or this Lakitu, who carries the newfangled camera in Super Mario 64, or the Luma, who hides in Mario's hat and shows the player when Mario's spin move is recharged. In this way, gameplay needn't be abstract systems but organic parts of the game world. Splatoon's producer also revealed that because shooting ink is a bit like spraying graffiti, the game got its punk rock music and 90s aesthetic. Similarly, the only reason Super Mario Sunshine is set on a tropical island is because the water pistol gameplay made the designers think about summer. The mechanic can even drive the narrative. Sorry to burst your bubble, but the story in the Zelda games isn't part of some grand overarching narrative, but it's simply there to bring out the best of the fun and interesting gameplay elements, according to the late Nintendo president, Satoru Iwata. A Link Between Worlds has a mad artist for an antagonist because Nintendo needed some reason for why Link can turn into a painting. And even Ocarina of Time's beloved story came from a process like this. Miyamoto wanted both young and teenage Link in the same game, so the writers had to come up with a time travel plot to make it happen. This might seem like a crazy way to come up with a story, but it can help ensure that there's a deep connection between what you do in the game and what happens in the story. Consider Yoshi's Island, which has a narrative about protecting Baby Mario, and gameplay mechanics about protecting Baby Mario. Most developers come at it the other way round. They dream up stories, characters, and worlds, and then work backwards to figure out what gameplay mechanics might fit. It's no surprise that they're rarely very successful. But okay, I shouldn't paint Nintendo as some game design gods and every other developer is just getting it completely wrong, though maybe. No. Nintendo gets it wrong sometimes, and other developers get it oh so right. Indie developers, for example, are particularly good at building their games around unique gameplay. And I loved how the new Doom completely orbits around the melee mechanic. It's at the heart of the combat system, it gives you health, and it ties into movement. You even use the melee button to open doors, just like how Samus opens doors by shooting them. Doom might be the most Nintendo game that Nintendo would never ever make. And then you get a game like Portal, which is so beautifully built around one super smart bit of interactivity that it's no surprise Miyamoto has said that game was amazing. Because for Nintendo, the way you play a game is simply more important than anything else. So it's not just the jumping off point for a new project, but every other element, the enemies, graphical style, locations, music, stories and characters, are picked and produced to frame the most fundamental aspect of a game. And when every aspect of the game is suggesting the way you play it, it becomes effortless to pick the game up and get stuck in. And so this is one big reason why Nintendo's games often feel quite different to everything else on the market. They're more playful and toy-like than most other games. They're more accessible and inviting, but no less complex. And quite frankly, they're some of the most elegantly designed games ever made. And so, Even after missteps and miscalculations, we're there, ready and waiting for whatever this iconic Japanese developer comes up with next. Hey there, thanks so much for watching. This episode was a pretty...
All right, awesome. But yeah, just to summarize, just like in your prototypes, it's essentially designing everything around those core mechanics. It makes everything feel a lot more fluid. It makes sense to all experience levels. Like another thing that I forgot to discuss was accessibility. So designing your games around different knowledge levels as well as skill levels is important. So people have played like a ton of games, they'll be able to pick up more complicated concepts a lot quicker. Whereas someone who's completely new to games or maybe has some sort of disability, you need to also think about them. So making it make sense visually is more important than you think. So like another example of something you could do besides making the design fit a mechanic, you could just use real life examples. So whenever you use an object from real life, make sure it actually functions the way people think. So if someone sees like a cardboard box, don't make it as heavy as a truck. Just very simple, subtle things like that can make your game feel a lot smoother than you think. Also, going back to that putting play first concept, although like designing everything around one mechanic seems logical and simple, it's not as easy as like you'd think. But it's definitely something that gets easier the more games you play. So the more prototypes you make, the more experiments you do, the easier it gets. And once you start putting it in front of people and they find it more and more engaging, you'll know that you are making progress. But yeah, those are the two main concepts I wanted to talk about, in addition to the recap for this session. I don't know if you had any questions, Vincent, about what I've said. Or if there's any issues or anything. You could also type it if you want. Oh, I've seen that you sent a form. One moment. If you are recording or watching the recording, we just got sent this form that we'd like you to fill if you were not able to make it to the session. So just like any feedback on this course, anything that any advice you could give me, I'd really appreciate the feedback because I definitely want to, make sure that this course is good in the future. All right, but I think that's everything. Thank you for joining if you had an opportunity this week. But yeah, it's been a good week. See you later.